Hello, Mage fans. This is Adam Simpson for Mage the podcast where we talk about all things Mage and a few things that aren't. And today I am joined by the intrepid Terry.
Hi.
Terry and I are going to talk today about the Tomes of Magic series, and today we're focusing on the Virtual Adepts Tradition book. Now, this would be the first one. It came out in 1994. About 66 pages long, and this was the final word on the Virtual Adepts for first and second editions. I wanted to make a mention of the time at which it came out, around the early 90s. There were a lot of people talking about virtual reality, which is one of the specialties of the Virtual Adepts in the world of Mage. There was a number of movies getting people talking about virtual reality in the early 90s. One that comes immediately to mind is Lawnmower Man, which I actually didn't see myself, but virtual reality focused very prominently in that film. And there were others. A lot of people had this sense that virtual reality was the latest thing. It was right around the corner. Give it, 1 to 5 years, and everybody was going to be using it. And so it was very topical that when Mage first edition hit the shelves in 1993, you had a group of technomages that were all about virtual reality. They knew it well. They were as excited about it as the public was, and they were going to be the ones to introduce it to the general public in the world of Mage. And so it seemed like it was well primed for our own real world. But what happened in our real world, unfortunately, was virtual reality wasn't quite ready yet. It kind of faded out of the headlines, and a lot of people slowly realized, oh, this is not right around the corner. This is still far off in the future. And so the side effect of that was the virtual adepts of Mage stayed cutting edge for roughly 25 years. Now, if that doesn't prove they're technomages, I don't know what does.
Yeah, that's a case of that's the real magic here. Staying hip and with it for a quarter century.
Yes, they had that in spades, still have it. Virtual reality is now becoming more mainstream. In fact, our own Terry here is using it in his own living room.
Yeah, it was the first time I read about the digital web, I'm like, oh, this is cute, but it could never replace normal human interaction. And then I got an HTC Vive, and then I played Beat Saber for 35 minutes, and I'm like, if you take this from me, I will cut you. So I feel like the Virtual Adepts downplay the digital web and how seductive it could be. But yeah, you're right. There was quite a movie streak around then. You had Lawnmower Man in 92. You had Johnny Mnemonic, Strange Days, Virtuosity. You had Tron in 82. You had Spy Kids 3D Game Over in 2003, the pinnacle of the genre. You had the first Matrix movie. Sadly, they never made a sequel. It was exciting times. And then when no one was looking in 2017, HTC and Oculus are like, hey, we figured it out. And everyone's like, son of a gun, they figured it out.
Well, some items on the technocracy's timetable take a little time to come around, but they finally do. If that's the case in your Mage Chronicle, that's up to each storyteller. But getting back to the book, this does not have a number on the spine. Tradition books published with magetheascension do not have numbers on the spine. So looking back on it years later, it can be a little tougher to slot it into the timeline. But this came out not too far after the digital web, which we have an episode discussing, but we're not going to assume you've heard that if you're listening to this episode. If you get curious, though, you can go back in our backlog and find that one. But it's good that you mentioned digital web, Terry, because this Virtual Adept Tradition book in several places refers to the digital web. That's the first digital web supplement for Mage. And it's kind of like a sister volume because there are a number of rules and more detailed information about using Technomagic through computers and going into VR in the digital web and Mage. And so the two books are pretty closely connected to each other. I can really understand why if a person picked up one book and got excited about it, they would naturally go and get the other.
I wonder if this was a case where some aspects in the World of Darkness games have been a response to the RPG world at large. Like the Tremere were added to Vampire because in development, someone was like, hey, where are the wizards? I wonder if it's one of those things where when Mage was being developed, they're like, hey, what's our response to Shadowrun or Cyberpunk being popular? And suddenly, ta-da, these things came into existence.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really good point there too. I think when Mage was in development, I think there was a desire to answer these very popular role-playing games at the time, Cyberpunk 2020, Shadowrun, and one or two others. They were saying, "Hey, we want a much broader view of magic. We want to have technomagic." Well, then it's only natural that we're going to get into hacker culture, computers, virtual reality, and a lot of other things. And the marketing people were probably thinking, hey, if you love Shadowrun, you can do that in Mage. And I mean, the hacker part of Shadowrun, anyways.
Yeah, and we hadn't quite gotten a fully developed notion of what technomancy would be. It didn't quite blossom into the full bleeding edge Clarke's second law that it seems to be interpreted as now, and it was kind of still stuck in the, well, wizards use wands, technomages use metal wands that have wires shoved into them. But we're getting there, and I feel like Virtual Adepts as a book was certainly a step forward, especially compared to some of the early convention books for the technocracy.
Yeah, and I can quite agree with that. Well, looking over this book, it is only 66 pages, but it does have a structure to it that will be familiar with those who have been reading through Mage tradition books. The basic structure boils down to an introductory fiction, then an introductory chapter, there's history, and then a chapter generally talking about the group. There are that group's views of others. We get sample characters, we get resources, which is usually more rules heavy, and then we get notable personalities. And after laying out the basic structure of the book, I actually wanted to talk about the book more as a whole, but there is a lot of good material in these sections. And so, Terry, can you walk us through that?
Sure. The introductory fiction, I first read this when I think I was in 7th grade. And I knew I wasn't playing D&D anymore when I read that, and it opens on a 2-page description of a virtual adept torturing someone. And I'm like, man, this is not what I was anticipating. That was eventually supplanted as things I felt uncomfortable reading in school when I got the Verbena tradition book, but we'll talk about that one later. It shows the darker side of the virtual adepts attempting to amp up their senses and increase their ability to take in information, and how that can be used against someone as a torture device. And that's one of those things that makes me fundamentally uncomfortable as a person, so we're going to speed past that section, except for I will say it's well written, all things considered.
Before you move on, one thing I wanted to contribute was reading back on that introductory fiction years later. What you say is quite true. I agree. But another thing to add is every tradition book adds a few rotes for the group in question. This one adds a rote called Information Glut, and that is the rote that they focus on in that introductory fiction. And I, as a Mage storyteller, I really liked it because it helps all of the Mage fans to see that rotes are not just spells off of a spell list like a lot of people from fantasy role-playing games are accustomed to seeing them. This is not, oh, this is a power that I can use to do something I want and then I kind of forget about it. It helps all of us to see that each of these rotes is a unique thing unto itself. It has its own history, it has its own background, it can be misused, it can be reinterpreted in a new way. And so I think it just helps all of us to remember that rotes can be more than just a power I pull out and use sometime. It can actually be a living, breathing part of the whole Mage world.
And in this case, despite it being the virtual adepts and eventually getting access to the sphere of data and spending their time in the digital web, this is very visceral, almost in the literal sense of viscera. So it's this very jarring, sure, we work in this pristine environment where information is king, but at the end of the day, we are sacks of meat and we will interface with it. And sometimes the Ascension War is very gut level in that regard. So it's very good as a reminder of what the stakes are in the first edition Ascension War.
I concur.
And then the next section we have is an introduction, which goes through a very quick Q&A about the group, which to me was nearly useless, but it sets up the attitude and the tone that you're going to expect throughout the rest of the book. The thing that I found interesting about the Virtual Adepts was kind of the focus on attitude and status, and we'll probably get into that later when we do the overall overview. But that attitude bleeds into all of the sections of the book, and the intro very much does that, where it has some very snarky Q&A of things like, "What do we do? I don't know. Go figure it out." And you're like, "Oh, that was a special kind of useless." And then we go on to a history section, which is done in epistolary style, as many of the early supplements were, where it's a whole bunch of letters and correspondences, which contains one of my favorites, where there is a long letter from a representative of the Council of the Nine Mystical Traditions, or in this case, the Council of the Eight Mystical Traditions, as the seat of correspondence was open. And Roger Thackeray, leader of the Virtual Adepts at the time, merely responds with, "We accept." And that was probably my favorite little segment in there. Moving on, there's a about the group section where they talk about the individual factions within the Virtual Adepts, and that is a breakdown that has largely stayed consistent through versions. Some of the traditions experience kind of an explosion of factions when going into revised and getting the revised tradition books. And I appreciated that there was some continuity there. So either Foresight or the person who did the revised book chose not to update those. And if you're interested about the Virtual Adept revised book, that is another episode that Joseph did with the author of that text, Maxwell. I don't recall. I should have grabbed that first. Then we go on to the stereotype section, views of others, and this was a section that kind of fell flat for me. Whenever I read a views of others section, I am always divided between, from an in-game perspective, yes, these are probably the views, and it gives mood and tone about how one group looks at another, but at the end of the day, I would really like something a little bit more nuanced for the players and the storytellers to read, as opposed to for the characters to read. That's a general beef I hold across editions. It started opening up into revised, but all in all, it's kind of a reiteration of stereotypes, but it also serves to point out the shortcomings of the Virtual Adepts. You have 60-some pages where it's rah, look at how amazing we are. We are redoing reality, but here's a reminder that even we, despite accusing everyone else of having a narrow purview, ourselves have a somewhat narrow purview. We get into sample characters, where they go over the templates, which are reasonably broad. Only one or two of the characters are stereotypical console jockeys. Then we get rotes, a few magical items, and finally notable personalities. The notable personality section was a little bit rough to me when I realized that me reading the book now am probably older than Dante was when he was being depicted in this book, and I just had a moment of, I've done nothing with my life. I do a Mage podcast. And those are the basic sections of the book. I'm like, he was born awakened.
Terry, I was going to say, Terry, you're no Dante.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But then I'm not either.
Yeah.
Of course.
Neither of us are, thank goodness. But yeah, one day we will be an oracle. I will be an oracle of math or an oracle of spreadsheets. I think that's the furthest I could get. In terms of the real life magical spheres, I think I have 3 or 4 dots in Excel, and that's probably the coolest thing I can say about myself, and 1 dot in podcasting. But that's neither here nor there. Did you have any particular commentary you wanted to add to the subsections, or?
Well, just briefly, the history section. As a fan of World of Darkness books, I have this sort of muscle memory whenever I'm reading I guess you could call them splat book, tribe book, clan book, tradition book. Whenever I get to the history section, I always kind of cringe a little bit, and it's like, okay, well, how much is there going to be in here that makes me wonder. But for this one, I don't remember any eye-rolling moments. I thought it was pretty good. They had potential to get goofy, and they decided not to. So I thought that was good. And under notable personalities, this is probably the most information we're going to get on the Dante character in first and second editions, and he graces the cover of every edition of Mage. So he is an NPC worth talking about, certainly.
I felt uncomfortable. The one instance where Dante comes up in canon that I did not like it was at the opening story of the digital web book. I always cringe when a character of note is given text that has been spoken or something like that, and if it doesn't absolutely stick the landing, it kind of makes me uncomfortable. Dante in my head is the elite uber hacker. So the idea that Dante would pop into the Crystal Palace, into the spy's demise, drop a data file for someone to carry, disappear, come back, grab it again, is kind of, I don't know. I don't feel like he would involve schlubs like that. But that's just the Dante that had been built up in my head. Like, if I could get a giant, like, Dante #1 fan t-shirt or something like that, I probably wouldn't, mostly because other people are probably bigger fans. I'm #3 or #5 fan or something in there. Let's keep things in perspective. But I did find it interesting that Cabrini Green, the area of Chicago where he is born, is brought up and was for years like the stereotype of this is what happens when urban planning goes south. The year after this book came out, Cabrini Green was demolished. So just one of those interesting cases where some of the old ties to World of Darkness don't quite make their way into 2019.
Okay. Yeah, I'd been to Chicago a few times, so I wasn't familiar with that history. Well, also notable personalities, the Demon Seed Elite is obliquely referred to. In fact, it's someone else who doesn't know much about it talking about this phenomenon, personality, what have you. And I thought that was a neat idea. I mean, reading through it, it's like, yeah, that is something pretty cool. You can drop into the lap of a storyteller and say, look, we're not getting into the details. We're not getting into the weeds. We just have this idea and this name. Can you take this somewhere? And as a storyteller, it's like, yeah, I'd like to take that somewhere.
Demon Seed Elite to me is always kind of this codicil of this applies to everyone, except for Demon Seed Elite, as just kind of that remarkable, this is other, this is uber, this is extra. For the listeners, Demon Seed Elite is this, urban legend practically of people using computers in lame ways. That's lame spelled with an 8, or however we did it in this book. Using computers in a lame way, and this embodiment of eliteness dropping out of the sky in the form of a monster truck and just flat out murderating that person. Whether it be with Cat 5 cables or I guess like Cat 2 cables. I don't know how Cat 5 numbering works actually. Cables like wrapped around their intestines and people having lame burned into their head or something. And it's just this force of nature. In retrospect, to me, that always sounded like kind of a extreme version of a paradox spirit, or maybe like a virtual adept marauder or something like that. But it is nice that even in an age of ubiquitous information, there are still things that are only spoken of in rumors, like Demon Seed Elite being the he who shall not be named of the virtual adepts.
Yeah, I think it's a neat idea, and I like the fact that they leave it kind of fuzzy. So it's like, storytellers, use this as you want to use this, make this into what you want it to be for your chronicle. But it's just that basic idea of, it's the internet. I sit in my chair and I look at my screen, and if I don't like what's happening, I just turn off my computer and I'm safe. And it's like, oh, you're not safe anymore. Magic is not safe.
Yeah, I guess the one question I constantly had while going through the early sections on the virtual adepts was, what were they like when they were a part of the technocracy? So they've been a part of the traditions for, let's round it off and say 50 years. And it's hard to change culture of a tradition in such a short period of time. But in this book, they are immediately presented as attitude is everything, douchey, status-obsessed people. Were they like that in the technocracy? Like, so you have the early history of them where they start out as the analytical reckoners, and then they become the difference engineers. And what were they like then? Was it the same way? Are they going through their teenage years now? Is this kind of their traditional Rumspringa or something like that? Or were they this much of a douchebag when they were with the technocracy? Like, I just picture these Iteration X people being like, this is unacceptable. Please comply with Regulation 4012B or something like that. Like, how did that work out? I would be fascinated if, when we get Victorian Mage, to see what the difference engineers or analytical reckoners, I can't remember which group it was at the time, like, were they that much of a dick then? Or is this a relatively recent phenomenon?
Yeah, hard to say, and something worth thinking about for your own chronicle. I believe that the canon details are they left the technocracy in 1955, floated around on their own for 6 years, and then joined the Council of Nine in 1961, if I'm remembering that correctly, and I believe I am. So, yeah, I mean, do you want to take 90s hacker culture and stick it into 1950? Does that add a little bonus to your game and make it fun, or is that just too far out of place? Every storyteller is going to make their own call on that, but yeah, it's worth discussing. I mean, were they did they have this attitude that was so strong and so in your face that leaving the technocracy was simply inevitable? And were they totally different from all the other conventions and everybody knew, wow, these guys just don't fit? Or is that something that has developed over the years because they've been out of the technocracy for decades? Even by the 90s, they had been out for decades. And so was it the new blood that came into the virtual adepts that made them this way, and they weren't quite that way in 1950s, early 50s? That's something that a storyteller is going to need to figure out, and it's worth discussing.
Yeah, Roger Thackeray, the primus of the tradition, has been in charge since the departure. I mean, he was involved in the World War II efforts for the technocracy, and he replaces the Penetone, something like that, previous person who was the head of the then convention, who was killed during a bombing of London coincidentally. But Roger Thackeray has been involved and been in charge kind of since then. So at least we have that unitary vision of him. We get more information about him in I guess the two texts that do it are, one, it's brought up in the original Euthanatos book, and also when we get to Horizon Stronghold of Hope. But I would be fascinated for more background on him. Very few of the primuses or the primi do we get much background information, except for the cases where someone's several centuries old. And I hope there is a Victorian Mage supplement that explains this. But I do like the idea of it's the 1950s and they're undergoing radical revolt and they're like, they're wearing slightly different colored ties than everyone else. This group is unruly. We should see what they're up to. Or something like that. I don't know why they always talk like it's a newsreel radio thing, like, and you have this just like, the conventions go to the talkies. That would have been 20s Mage, but still.
Yeah. Well, discussing the book as a whole, there are a few sections I was wanting to discuss, and really I think it helps frame the discussion for the listeners to start off with what is a tradition book in Mage supposed to do. And of course people are going to have different opinions. I don't mind being told how wrong I am on this, but my impression is what a tradition book is mainly supposed to do is three things. First off is give us a handle on the group. And what I mean by that is give us a sense of their history, what are their overarching goals as a group, and can you give us a general sense of what the group is like, what they talk about, what they try to be like, who they feel comfortable with, etc. Second one is give us more of an idea for using them. How can, both as a storyteller and as a player, how can we actually put these into a chronicle and do something more interesting with them? And part of that is expanding the possibilities for them. Not only should we know what is the stereotype for this group, but how can we push out of that stereotype into other possibilities? And last is give us some group-specific resources. In Mage, that would be give us some rotes, give us some NPCs, give us some items like that we can just drop into our game and use it, and it is appropriate that this group would know these things or do these things. And so I'm not going to give a general opinion on the book as a whole till we get towards the end of the podcast. But I will say I certainly liked the book. But I think that is what a tradition book is supposed to do. And so it's worth discussing, did this book hit those marks? Did it do what it is supposed to do? I would generally say yes, it did.
I'm going to generally agree with that. There were a few corners or rough edges. I am the person watching a movie that I was always looking for plot holes. So I feel bad in that as a natural critic, when I gain willpower whenever I find one of those errors. But the flip side of that, personality-wise, is I tend to destroy beautiful things otherwise. And there were a few corners, a few things that didn't quite make sense to me. But considering it's the first tradition book, I feel like Virtual Adepts stuck the landing in a way that maybe the Progenitors' first convention book didn't quite. And listening back on the interview with the author of the revised tradition book, who said that the Virtual Adepts needed an overhaul, I am certainly fine with that interpretation and to say, yes, we are going to do this overhaul, but I think most of this book does a remarkably good job of staying together. I guess one of the big questions is, how do you interpret technology and technomancy? And before the show, Adam brought up one of the critical problems of the difficulty with technomancy is technology makes progress in an obvious and present way that is not mirrored with more mystical trades. So if a piece of magic is tied to the quality of your computer, Moore's law is going to kick in, and theoretically your magic should be twice as potent 12 or 18 months later, in a way that if you do divination by consuming ecstasy and then looking into goat's intestines, like there isn't that same sense of progress there. So how do you deal with the fact that the bleeding edge for technomancy keeps moving? And we don't really get a discussion of that, and I don't feel in the World of Darkness we get a very good answer for that. But other than that very basic question, I feel like this book really holds together.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I think the book does hold together. It does its main job. One of those leads me into my next section, and that was where I wanted to talk about a number of the big ideas behind the virtual adepts. And I think the book does a very good job of laying some out, and in others it refers to them, or you could say it hints at them, but it doesn't bring them out explicitly. And whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, it really is a matter of opinion. But first off, when talking about these big ideas, the first one would be that it's neat to have the virtual adepts in the world of Mage, because there are going to be a lot of new people coming in and playing this game, and they're not so familiar with magic as a topic. They're not so familiar with the world of darkness, and the virtual adepts give them a very relatable character. It's like, oh, they live in cities and they dress in modern clothes and they use computers and they go on the internet. Well, even in the 90s, there were people who'd say, well, I know that. I can do that. I can put my head into this virtual space. And so it was nice that all these people coming into Mage who aren't really sure what to think about mystical magic, it's like, oh, well, I don't have to jump into this game with both feet. I can take a more soft option with the virtual adepts. They use laptops and networks, and I get that. I don't need to learn very much or get into uncomfortable territory to try this character. So it was nice to offer that to them. Also, one thing I would like to say, I set up the Anders Mage Page 2.0 website to sort of bring back some of the older resources from the 90s when this book was out. And the Virtual Adept page, I think, is definitely worth checking out if you're going to use Virtual Adepts in your chronicles. If you go to mage.gearsonline.net/Anders, and we'll put a link for you in the show notes, you will see on Anders Mage Page 2.0, and if you click on the factions and then the traditions and then virtual adepts, you'll get to the virtual adepts page. There's some good resources for you. I would especially recommend that you take a look going down the page a bit. There's philosophy, there's theurgy of the virtual adepts and virtual adept koans, which is both amusing and thought-provoking. And then towards the bottom under more information, you'll find a link to Anders Sandberg's own page on transhumanism, which I think is definitely worth checking out. So let's get a link for the listeners into the show notes so they can see what I'm discussing there. Definitely worth your time. And one of the basic ideas put forth in this book was, it wasn't put forth in this book very explicitly, but it was hinted at. And that is an example of early first edition metaplot. As we get into the later editions of Mage, the metaplot for magetheascension is more detailed, it's more explicit, it's more clearly laid out. It reads more like a story and less like a list of hints. But in early first edition, it was much less explicit. It was basically hints placed in the text that the readers were supposed to latch onto. And for virtual adepts, that early first edition metaplot was, will the virtual adepts last in the traditions? That is hinted at in this book, but not brought out explicitly. When we are introduced to the virtual adepts in the first edition core book, the idea is planted there that they have not been with the Council of Nine Mystic Traditions for very long. They used to be part of the technocracy, so they're not trusted very much. There's some negative feelings going on. There's a little bit of friction in personalities between virtual adepts and other members of the Council of Nine. And so the question was hanging in the background, and that is, Are the virtual adepts going to stay in the Council of Nine Mystic Traditions, or will they pick up and say, you know what, we don't like you guys anymore, we're striking out on our own, we've done it before, we can do it again? Or are they going to get kicked out of the Council of Nine because they just don't belong and it's just not working out? Are the technocracy going to seduce them back into the technocracy? These are possibilities that I think the authors of the first edition core book wanted people to explore and play with. And in later years, talking with Mage fans, I have met a lot of people who simply assume, oh, yeah, they belong in the Council of Nine. The VAs are comfortable there. They're the computer admin for Chantries, as we see in the Book of Chantries. They fit comfortably. Why would anyone be thinking about them leaving? Everybody gets along. We have mixed player cabals where the virtual adepts mix with the other characters so well. And I like getting back to this early idea of, hey, it wasn't set in stone. There were a lot of people wondering, how is this going to turn out? And this book does hint at it.
Yeah, there are two kind of stereotypes that always came up there. One was the "damn it, Johnson, you do that again and you're off the force" aspect of it as they're going back and forth and pranking and stuff. And on the virtual adept side, I kind of feel like at times they're screaming, "You're not my real dad." But yeah, it is weird going back and being like, oh, this is a thing that didn't really pan out. In the same way that when we were reading the convention book Progenitors, they're like, whatever you do, steer clear of fairies, and you're like, what the dink? So, not everyone makes it to second edition, but.
Yeah. Well, after introducing the virtual adepts, some of the big ideas I was referring to a few moments ago was transhumanism. Transhumanism is hinted at a few times in the book rather obliquely, and that is something that I didn't catch on to very well myself, but I was visiting Anders' Mage page about the time this book came out, and one of the things that Anders Sandberg did for the community of Mage fans that I think was very helpful was very early on, Anders Sandberg looked at the first edition core book. He read about the virtual adepts and he said, oh, yeah, these guys fit so well with this idea of transhumanism that I've already taken an interest in. And in different articles and pieces that Anders Sandberg put onto his site, he made more clear to us how this link between transhumanism and the virtual adepts is a natural fit. And he helped me to really see that. And that was something that I brought into my games and really benefited from. And to help everyone understand what transhumanism is, it is, some would say it's a movement or a philosophy. There are a number of adherents in the real world who get very excited about the topic. I'm not a transhumanist myself, but I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there. It's basically the idea that there's this very positive view that technology is going to eventually allow humans to become something more than human. They will be able to expand their capabilities, expand their world, expand their experience, so that they become a greater beings, and society becomes a much more capable, knowledgeable, advanced thing as a benefit of technology. And of course, the science fiction novels have been talking about this for a very long time. There's a number of stories about a far future setting where people exist as in digital form as a sort of super software in these super networks that literally span throughout the entire solar system. And because they exist in a digital space, they have much greater memory, they have much faster thinking, they have a much broader view, and their opinions are much more open-minded, and society is just, totally advanced, and it's a great thing to sum up.
A type of open-minded, and it's kind of interesting that, like, this is one of the cases of the embarrassment of riches that we have, it being 2019. The fact that Anders Sandberg, intellectual at the Future of Humanity Institute, when he was in his 20s, was writing papers on transhumanism that he has made free to the public, and then goes on to do a TED Talk about the topic. So it is not like we are promoting... This is a bit more than a fan theory when Adam mentions, oh, by the way, Anders' Mage page has this little aside on the topic. But it's kind of interesting that they are presented in a very particular type of transhumanism, that technology will allow people to unleash their potential, as opposed to, say, Iteration X, which says the merger of person plus machine is a fundamentally different entity that will have ethics and ideals that are different than what we have now. And the dichotomy between those two is pretty potent to me. The virtual adepts are all about let's use technology to drag people out of the mud, but we don't need to fundamentally change necessarily what a person is. Their vision of ascension is the idea that everyone will have their potential fully realized, but they will at the end of the day still be fundamentally human, in my opinion, in comparison to the progenitors or iteration X that believe that humanity as a biological entity and as an idea is merely a stepping stone to whether it be a fully integrated world mind or this perfectly efficient cyborg hybrid. There's a difference there, and that goes in the big bucket of themes that can be explored if a storyteller is interested in it.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That is a topic that we've been discussing for a long time. As Mage fans, of course, as Terry is very well aware. But yeah, I was going to mention that too. The fact that the Iteration X is often seen as a natural opponent for the virtual adepts because both of them work a lot with computers. They're both very excited about and working towards a future of higher technology. They're both tied closely to electronics. And if you look at the stereotypical Iteration X thinker or member, what you've got is someone who's thinking, I look forward to a great future where humanity is fully merged with computers or artificial intelligence or electronic systems so that humanity transforms into something different than it was before, and there's this assumption that that something will be better. Whereas you have the virtual adepts who, the stereotypical virtual adept is going to say, we're going to use technology to make humanity what it was always meant to be, but it will still be fundamentally human. Whereas the Iteration X people are like, we're going to transform into something different. It's something 50% human, 50% other, and we're assuming it's going to be a great thing.
Yeah, and that's a theme that I feel changes over time. We've gotten, I feel as a culture, we've gotten more accepting of the philosophical position that maybe human minds are not the sole entities that are worthy of moral appreciation. I'm someone who went vegetarian out of concern for animal suffering. Maybe veganism is in my future, but darn, do I like half and half. And the idea that we could inadvertently create minds that are worthy of ethical appraisal is a question that was kind of being brought up in the 90s, but it was very much in the we can't make generalized artificial superintelligences because it'll kill us all. And that is still a concern, and I would argue it is a bit more of a concern, yet another topic where everyone take a drink, where Anders discusses future perils. But I feel as if it is a case where the philosophical undercurrent of a group has moved over time, where the idea that we are going into this weird future thing where the boundary lines between humans maybe isn't as sharp as it is at current is getting a little bit more currency, and how some of the traditional arguments in Mage have shifted over time from mysticality versus technology to something where it is freedom and choice versus subordination. And that becomes the big difference between the virtual adepts and Iteration X.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some science fiction novels describe a future where all of humanity, all human beings have merged into a sort of super hive mind that does amazing projects and accomplishes amazing things. And then you have the discussion, well, is that good or bad? And it's an interesting discussion. And Mage, I think a really good Mage Chronicle involves some action, some adventures, some character development, but also some big ideas, some moments where you can slow down the pace and discuss some of these things in character and talk about the ramifications of them. And transhumanism is a very interesting topic that is only hinted at in this book, but if you dig deeper, you'll find something worth finding. Now, another of the big ideas that this book brought out more explicitly was a way for the virtual adepts to talk about magic and the underpinnings of reality. And they decide that information is not just an abstract concept. It's not just a resource. It is also a force of nature. It is also a philosophical element to all of their discussions. They even talk about a 10th sphere that the virtual adepts would call information. And it says that there are attempts by the virtual adepts to actually present this formally to the Council of Nine Mystic Traditions and say, hey, we really think that there is a 10th sphere. We think that it really is about information. Here's our points. Here's what we think. And it says in the book that the rest of the Council of Nine said, we don't agree. We're striking this down. It's not ready yet, or we just fundamentally disagree with you. And so there may be some virtual adepts who have their nose out of joint about that and want a second try at proving it. And then there's going to be a lot of virtual adepts who say, look, that's above my pay grade. You guys talk about philosophy. I've got some practical things to do.
And philosophically, that's one of those interesting things where it kind of predicted and then followed what was happening in the sciences at the time. You have this idea of the holographic principle, that all of reality is defined by interactions taking place on a 2D surface at the edge of the known universe, and that those elements are creating, a la hologram, the set of interactions that appears to us as a embed in 3 space. And it's one of those cases where, like, you can't say that they're wrong. It's just a different way of viewing things. But at the same time, it wasn't developed to the point where we eventually get that data sphere. Now, the sphere of information that they propose, to me, was always much more fundamental than the data sphere, which is why they don't refer to it that, which is, I think, why they chose the term data sphere as opposed to sphere of information, because that was already taken as their 10th sphere. But can I dive into a few of the corner observations, or do you have any more big themes that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I had one more thing for the basic ideas section, but let us know what you're thinking.
Going through, there are, as I said, there are usually little throwaway lines that, at the time the authors writing this were trying to inspire, but after a certain amount of time passes, these kind of become holy texts where we have flame wars on the internet over the exact interpretation of a single line that is included in some book that not everyone has. And there were a few of those to me. One of them was the idea that the line, we choose the sleepers we awaken, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if that was arrogance or to imply under first edition rules that people could be shepherded more directly into awakening. But the other thing I like that a tradition book will ideally do to me is give me a whole bunch of stuff that I wouldn't have been able to think up on my own. Like, if you give me the virtual adepts, I probably would have come up with virtual adept groups that are pretty similar to what is presented here. But then you get into the nooks and crannies, and you get the idea of, okay, the Crystal Palace, their ancestral chantry, for lack of a better term, is located in Omaha, and they have semi-annual gatherings there. I'm always curious how people who do not have access to the digital web interface with that. There are a few, so what happens there? They introduce the idea of a rote library, that virtual adepts are able to scan this database of rotes, download something to their computer, 512K. So I'm pretty sure at this point, a lot of those rotes could be run on my toaster to generate a magical effect. And what was the other one? Oh, they introduced both social engineering as a vague reference where they say characters with at least 2 dots of mind and a bunch of dots of subterfuge can probably do this thing. And at the time, I read that, I'm like, social engineering, that'll never catch on. And then you realize in retrospect that like 95% of all breaches that have ever occurred into corporate data stores in one form or another involve someone very nicely saying, hey, I forgot my password. Can you reset this for me? Can you send it to john1234 at Yahoo? Yeah, my corporate email's locked out at current. That was something I didn't really have an appreciation for at the time. And the final thing is, this book gives me one of my favorite roles that occurs in Mage, when a mage declares war on another virtual adept, when one virtual adept picks a fight with another, and they declare a core war, and they tie their avatar into a computer, and they have to make a computer plus avatar roll. So we need more nonsensical combinations like that. Roll enigmas plus pottery. Yes. And those are my little takeaways that kind of made me smile as I'm going in. I'm like, ooh, this is proof that this person is vastly more clever than I will ever be.
Yeah. I also like those unusual dice roll combinations. I think that you look back at first and second edition core books, and it's like they were just assuming, hey, storytellers, take the 2 that you think are going to fit no matter how odd they are and use it in your game. Go for that. You have our blessing. And then later on, in play and talking with people, there's these set things. Oh, you're going to do that? Well, it's this skill with that attribute, and that's how you do that. Why would you do it any other way? This is how we do it. And so people of all stripes can get set in their ways, and it's nice to remind people, hey, shake it up a bit. Now, in the basic ideas category, the last one I wanted to talk about was something that was discussed a lot in this book and put very much in the forefront, and that was the deadliness of the VA virtual adept technocracy divide. They hate each other. They kill each other whenever they can find each other. It's some would say hot war as opposed to cold war. A hot war where it's like we're really fighting. We're really trying to kill each other. We're trying to make this a war of attrition. That was very much an early first edition approach to the world of Mage the Ascension. And so it fits that we find it in this book that was in the early days of first edition. That's how the world of Mage was portrayed. As you push the calendar forward a bit and you get into later second edition and revised, and after that you have more of an option of a sinister technocracy that is actively trying to kill everyone, or you can have a sinister technocracy that's a little more low-key and in the background, or you can even have a more even-minded approach to the technocracy. They're doing some good, they're doing some bad. Sometimes there's fights, sometimes there's cooperation, sometimes, a man in black and a virtual addict can find each other, look at each other warily and say, hey man, I'm watching you, and then they walk away. That's more of an option nowadays. And so I think it's interesting to point this out. It adds some color and some flavor to the world of Mage. It makes sense that a group that recently left the technocracy would have generated a lot of animosity, and so you can make that a part of your game. But unlike the portrayal of this book, I just like to remind people that, look, this is an option. This is not a requirement. You can portray the technocracy and the virtual adept technocracy divide in any way that you choose. This is only one choice of many.
I would love there to eventually be a big book of world-building choices for Mage. I feel like when a storyteller sets down to build a chronicle, there's 30 or 40, probably 200 actually, basic choices they make about the version of Mage they're going to run. And this is independent of the story, but where you answer that question of, is the technocracy a monolithic entity? Are they all faceless? Is it an organization of people? Do they have the best interests of humanity in mind? How well are they achieving that? How many vampires are there? What is the nature of the 9 mystical traditions? And just a giant list, kind of like a menu that a storyteller could choose from if they wished to. And that is one of those, that is one of the sections of that menu. What do you want the fundamental nature of the technocracy to be? Yeah, in first edition it was pretty clearly good guy versus bad guy. And then eventually it gets to be this super blurry thing where the technocrats are good guys more or less, but Nephondic Infiltration has changed that, and Project Invictus and New Avalon are trying to purge that. And even in M20 there's kind of an option where the traditions and the technocrats are not quite holding hands and skipping into the sunset, but where they are both purged and pure, but small and dealing with a uncaring world. Again, you got options.
Yeah. And I was actually going to put together a web page form where you can, use radio buttons, checkboxes, and short text type-ins and set all of the different details for a chronicle. But then I started thinking, you know what? Demon Seed Elite might be real.
Yeah.
I don't want to chance this one. I'm not going to take that risk. I want to stay alive.
If you don't use strict HTML, they'll find you.
Yeah. But all joking aside, I like talking about those basic ideas that the book mentions, some explicitly, some only hinting at, and it's nice to bring those into the forefront for the discussion. But moving on, when it comes to portraying the virtual adepts in a chronicle, whether you're a storyteller or a player, there are a couple of things I want to talk about. And I have to come clean and say a number of these topics, the reason I want to talk about them is because of my experience talking with other Mage players and Mage fans. There are some things that I just assumed were options that other people thought had to be done, and vice versa. And so some of these things that come to me is I'm actually surprised by the number of people I talk to who have this firm belief that the virtual adepts are the best at computer technomagic ever. They are just the pinnacle, and no one comes close. Why, those technocrats who spend all their time with advanced technology online and using computers constantly, why, they're not virtual adepts, so their skill just isn't the same. I'm sorry. When the virtual adept comes into the room, it's clear who's on top. And I say this, half jokingly, but honestly, I have talked to a lot of people who say, well, you have to admit, no one comes as close as the VAs in computer knowledge. And hey, the way you run your chronicle is going to work for your chronicle. But just to give you my perspective, I have never made that assumption. I know that the virtual adepts as a group was fundamental in creating and making use of computers. But honestly, most of those guys aren't alive anymore in the world of Mage by the time we get to even 1994. So I just make the assumption that the virtual adepts are among the best and most skilled when it comes to networks and computers and related technomagic. But I am very comfortable saying that there are members of the New World Order, Iteration X, and Void Engineers who are as skilled as the virtual adepts. I don't think this is game breaking or theme breaking or anything like that. And also, I think it helps the drama when the virtual adept goes online and says, hey, I'm good at what I do, but the Iteration X guys, they have some people that are better than me and some people who are on my level. And so if I get too cocky, I might be in trouble, but I still put on that false front. I want everyone to think I am the best, even though I know the truth. And so, yeah, I like to emphasize to people that it's like, look, you don't have to shake in your boots just because it's a virtual adept. There are other people who can do the same things, and they're just as good.
And one way of appraising that is, what do they get done with what they have at hand? And the virtual adepts strike me as profoundly efficient in terms of, you give a virtual adept $1,000, you're going to have the best possible computer you can have for $1,000. But Iteration X has the syndicate. Like, when it is great to be like, oh, wow, he can do amazing things on a shoestring budget. Look at how elite this virtual adept is. Like, that's all well and good, but up against the entire combined might of Iteration X, who can bear down on a single question and has broken down every problem into 200 sub-problems that are being tackled by global leading experts, that's hard to beat. In the same way that within the Hermetics, you have the boastful, prideful people, and then you have House Bonnie Sages that keeps its head down, and every time it pops up, some bit of world-changing lore has been revealed. I feel like the Virtual Adepts very much split into the people who boast. The Venn diagram of people who boast and people who are good don't always overlap. The Chaoticians, for example, do not strike me necessarily as a boastful group, but something tells me they get their shit done.
Yeah, and I certainly like those guys. I'm going to move to the legions or subgroups within the virtual adepts because there's some very interesting topics there. But just sticking on this topic, in one chronicle that I was running, the player was saying to me that, look, I've been trained, my character has been trained by the virtual adepts, and we think outside of the box. We have, very cutting edge, open-minded thinking, so our code just can't be beat. And I said, yeah, basically, I agree with you. Yes, you do have a very valid point, but your character has experienced Iteration X programmers who have better systems and faster access to the internet. And so basically, yes, you are very thinking outside the box with, and that's good. That gives you an edge, but they have a technological resource edge. And so when you compare the two, they're roughly comparable. So, please keep this in mind. You're not going to make an easy sweep every time you go into a situation. And my player got that. He thought about it and he said, yeah, that is a point. The virtual adepts are largely isolated. They are often distrustful even of each other. They've been on the run for a while. They have resources, but they know that the technocracy has a lot more resources, more current resources, more money to spend, more cooperation from sleeper authorities and institutions. And so that not only emphasizes the drama, but it makes sense to have these virtual adepts who are very skilled and very cutting edge with the kinds of things they will try in their programming code, yet at the same time they know that they're outgunned, they're outmanned, and they're worried. And there's a reason why a lot of them stay in their sanctums or their apartments and use a holographic representation or a network connection to help out a team that's in the field, and they're not in the field because they know how much is at risk and they know what might go wrong.
And that's partially because Sanctum was utterly broken in first edition. But yeah, it's one of those things where, yeah, you're elite, but there's 5 of you. How much are you able to do against 10,000 foot soldiers? What can you do against the entire computer science department of Carnegie Mellon, which is just an extension of the Void Engineers or something like that? You are great and amazing, and you can change the world, but as Chaos Factor proves, it's hard. That is a tough ball to roll up a very steep hill.
Yeah, and when people look back on the hacker culture and the elite culture, I guess, of the 80s and 90s, there's this image of sort of a film noir image of a guy hiding in an apartment with the blinds down, and he's connecting on his computer, and he hopes nobody finds his physical apartment address. And that popular image can come into Mage and actually make some sense, because the virtual adepts are hiding. They are worried about being discovered. There's a reason for this if you want to pursue that whole aesthetic.
And then there's the close-up where computer text is somehow being projected onto their face from the screen, despite the fact that that is not how monitors work. But yeah, that's the real magical effect here.
Yeah. Well, moving on, I have also talked to a lot of people who want this very firm wall between technomagic and mystical magic. I've talked to a number of people who really want to emphasize that, hey, my virtual adepts and technomancers don't believe in magic, or believe that what they're doing, magic may be real, but what they're doing isn't magic. They firmly have this idea that if there is magic, I'm not doing it. I'm just using really advanced technology. And that idea and that thinking, it belongs in Mage. It takes on new significance, and it's really great. But I think if you overemphasize it, you lose some of the foundational themes of Mage. And what I mean by this is the first edition core book of Mage and later books after that give us this theme of mages stepping beyond the mystical veil. Magic isn't just something they talk about and use on occasion. It is a whole element of reality that they have become a part of. They live in magic. Magic affects them just like they affect magic at times. And so this was supposed to be reinforced to players by having odd, mystical occurrences happen. And sort of this idea that, hey, there are supernatural forces at play and they have a link to me. I can't just close the door and walk away from them and pretend they're not there, because they're going to find me in some form or another, maybe good, maybe bad. And so I like having that element there. I like saying that, yes, virtual adepts use technomagic and they don't get into all that mystical stuff, but there still should be this idea hovering at the back of their mind. It's like, well, is there more going on than I think? Are the mystics, are they talking about things that I'm a part of, even if I don't think I am, even if I don't want to be? The way a storyteller might emphasize this is you can have mystical occurrences crop up even for a virtual adept. You can have a VA jack into his computer when he wakes up and he hears a story about someone being infected by a virus. You could say, oh, in Africa, there's this area where a whole bunch of people caught a virus. And the mage's like, oh, well, okay, glad I don't live there. And then later on, he sees an article in a news magazine about computer viruses. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's the thing people are talking about. And then have a couple more of these odd sort of reminders where it's like there's this idea of a virus in the mage's mind. And then in the chronicle, like maybe the next session you have with this player, the virtual adept is going to find that his Trinary computer, his virtual adept special laptop, is sending off network calls that he knows nothing about. And it's like, well, did somebody hack into my machine and really mess it up? And then he, burrows into it, really investigates, and he finds out that there's an AI that got onto his machine from the digital web, and it's not hurting him, but it's living on his machine. And so it's like there's this idea of, he starts talking to it, really communicating with it, and there's this idea of, well, artificial intelligence is just code that I wrote. It's just a machine, but this thing's talking to me like a real living, breathing being. And gosh, I've been seeing all these hints about viruses infecting things, and here my computer is infected by a virus in a sense. And long story short, what I'm trying to hint at is there should be mystical elements that are part of even a virtual adept's life. I don't like having this very strict wall between technomagic and mystical magic. They're so different, they're worlds apart. It's like, no, let them rub up against each other. Let there be gaps in that wall where things kind of filter through. Make it less clear cut, because that gives a lot of food for thought to your players and gives real thought-provoking gaming sessions.
I do like the idea of an artificial intelligence being essentially how I treat mice. Being like, darn it, we got AIs in the web again. And you have to go in and clear out the AI traps before they try and take over humanity or something like that. And in Revised, I think it was first introduced in Revised, we have the idea of the 4 stages of belief in a paradigm, where you start out with a surface belief that the mage does not go into metaphysics. It is questionable to them if they're practicing magic at all, or if it's just a natural extension of their capabilities. And from what you're saying, technomancers are much more prone to kind of sticking in that stage of the four phases before they go on to a shallow understanding where they get the idea of maybe what a rote is, and that there is a metaphysics happening, to the ultimate level where they have deeply personalized beliefs into how they blend into the Tellurian. But yeah, I'd certainly agree that technomancers are disproportionately likely to kind of stay at some of the more superficial understandings of what they're really doing. I was never one for the idea that an awakened person would ever count as a witness for an effect that another awakened person was doing, but I certainly know that there are people who depart from that. Most of my storyteller experiences with virtual adepts are people who were never the cool kid, trying to be the cool kid and invariably being hit by buses. It's one of the lesser known rotes that pops up in my campaign. You have 2 dots in incompetent role-playing and 3 dots in being a douchebag who doesn't do your research, and the result of that effect is you get hit by a bus. It works like a charm. I recommend other storytellers use it. But yeah.
That's tough love from a storyteller.
Exactly. Sometimes death is the best teacher.
Yeah. Well, like all tradition books, we get, for lack of a better term, subgroups. These are subgroups inside of the tradition. And it's interesting that they have different names. Hermetics have their houses, and virtual adepts have their legions. And I think this is a tongue-in-cheek joke reference to the New Testament story of Jesus dealing with the man who was infected by a group of demons that called themselves Legion. And no, I'm not going to get into a lesson on the Bible here, but I think it's a tongue-in-cheek reference to that. So these legions, we get 4 of them. They are called the cyberpunks, the cypherpunks, the chaoticians, and the reality hackers. In some tradition books, they attempt to make 4 groups and tie each one to a mystical essence. In this book, they say that the virtual adepts are mostly dynamic essence. There are a few questing. There are very few pattern, and they don't worry about the rest. And
take that, primordial.
Yeah, as a storyteller, I don't adhere to that so closely. I say no. I like to open it up more. Let the player choose their essence and explain to me how it fits for their character, and I'm going to let them run with that. And I think that adds something to the game. But getting back to this one, the 4 legions inside the virtual adepts are not at all tied to essences. They are tied to different, philosophies or approaches. With the cyberpunks and the cypherpunks, we get the 2 groups that are closer to the stereotypical view of the virtual adepts, which, of course, is very popular with a lot of people. They are the 2 groups that use a lot of computers. They are interested in the potentials of virtual reality. They spend time online and in the digital web, which is sort of the mystical mage specific online for the world of Mage. These are the characters who are so much interested in technology, and the typical hacker attitude shows up more in these groups. These cyberpunks are supposed to be the really stereotypical 90s hacker style people. They're the ones who are loud, brash, in your face. It even says they don't worry about paradox as much. And the cypherpunks are the more, you might say, mature, toned down, careful virtual adepts. They're doing many of the same things that the cyberpunks are doing, but they're a little more careful about paradox. They're a little less concerned with attitude and more concerned with results and possibilities. And I like these 2 groups. I think they fit very well, and I'm glad they're offered as options to the players. Moving on, we have the chaoticians, who are a very interesting group. They are less stereotypical virtual adepts. They are closer to intellectuals. They can use computers if the player chooses, but it's less of a focus for this legion. They use calculators more, and they are more interested in the sphere of entropy, in possibilities. And they would lean closer to some groups that you might find inside the Void Engineers. Moving on, you've got the reality hackers, and this is supposed to be the newest and smallest legion of the 4. And this is more of the big concept, big idea sort of a thing. They can use computers, of course. They can go to the digital web if the player of that character wants to, but this legion focuses more on hacking as a metaphor for altering reality. And so these are the groups who would use their advanced knowledge and their strong exploration of certain abstract themes to use real world technology or future technology to change someone's body without putting them in a cloning tank of the progenitors. They would hack the city so that a certain possibility will occur tomorrow when there's a small chance of it happening. It's more of an abstract idea, and I really like the inclusion. As a storyteller, one thing that I like to do for my players is to offer them a soft technomancer option. What I mean by that is the books of Mage offer this idea that to make technomancers different from the mystical mages, they can start dropping their need for a focus at Arete 6 instead of Arete 2. So they need their foci more and for a longer time than the mystical mages do, but they get this advantage of their foci is known to sleepers and it's easier for them to pull off coincidental magical effects. And I like to offer a soft option to my players and say, hey, you have the choice of making a technomancer who is more into abstract theoretical ideas and leans less on actual gadgets and gizmos and technology. And so you can start dropping a focus at Arete 2 instead of Arete 6, but the disadvantage you get is you are pulling off more big idea kind of technomagic, and so it is easier for you to get paradox, and it is more difficult for you to explain away your magical effects as, hey, I picked up the device and hit the button. Of course it's going to do that.
Those kind of things always struck me as also being slower, that when a reality hacker does a coincidental effect, it's one of those weird things where depending on the perspective, the exact same statement can be interpreted differently. And when a iteration X says everything is a system, people look at them as being coldly rationalizing. But when a reality hacker says everything is a system, people are like, whoa.
Yeah.
And they are taking advantage of that second thing, much like the fact that a lot of the things that the Syndicate or the New World Order does don't actually look like magic. If a reality hacker puts enough time and planning into it, then what they do is going to appear profoundly coincidental. But certainly anything faster than that is going to start being like, wait, how did that? What did you do there? Why is okay?
Yeah, and that's getting into a discussion of paradigm, which is very interesting, and I always like it when you lead me down that path. But I'm going to try and stick a little closer to the Virtual Adept book today. But just to touch on what I was talking about, the paradigm is going to be a little different for, say, a chaotician and a reality hacker as compared to a cyberpunk or a cypherpunk. And that's something that a storyteller should consider, and certainly touches on what you were saying about how when a reality hacker is going to pull off an effect, it's going to be broader, slower, a little less flashy and dramatic, but still very much magic and very helpful to their goals. But I wanted to end this talk on, or this section on legions, by saying that I have talked to a number of mage players who assume that when they make up a tradition mage, they are required to choose one of the subgroups, in this case legions. And I just want to help everybody remember that when you make a virtual adept character, you don't have to choose a legion. I think it is very reasonable for the storyteller to say, hey, the virtual adepts have these 4 legions, and each legion is active and doing its thing, but there are a lot of virtual adepts who don't belong to them. They might have a friend there, they might meet them and talk with them, but they don't consider themselves a member. So you don't have to be in one of these groups. I mean, play your character the way you want to.
Or it could be one of those cases where all characters are sorted into one of the 4 houses, as it were, but they just don't spend much time dealing with it. And even within the character examples we get, a bunch of them don't fit very obviously into a group. I'd be hard pressed to say that at the end of the day that the couch potato is truly a cyberpunk that is that is on the bleeding edge of elite. But you know what? 3 dots of correspondence gets some stuff done.
Yeah. So moving on, we got to discuss, at least for a moment, the Trinary computers. Now, I am going to put myself right into the middle of roiling controversy and say that as a Mage fan, I have always kind of had a problem with Trinary computers. And in my experience, I'm the only one in that position. I've talked to other Mage fans, and they think I'm a bit of an oddball. But hey, everybody who knows me thinks I'm a bit of an oddball, so I'm comfortable in that space. And I'm going to say that even when I was in my teenage years and I was first reading about Trinary computers in my early 20s, I was thinking, this doesn't fit for me. I don't like this idea. It says that most computers work through on-off, or positive, negative, or 1 or 0, and that is of course representing how in an electronic circuit either there's electricity going through the wire or there isn't. And that's why we have this on-off. They call it Boolean binary. In programming, it's called true-false. And the idea that has been pushed to us since first edition and on down the line is that Trinary computers don't work in on or off. They work in on, off, or maybe. And because of that, they're such better computers. They have much greater capabilities. And isn't that cool? It's fundamentally different. I admit I'm the odd man out, but I didn't think that was cool. I always thought this doesn't work for me. I think it's kind of silly. But I like having that idea in the world of Mage. I like having it be one of the virtual adept pranks. The virtual adepts say to people outside of their group, oh yeah, we use Trinary computers. We discovered maybe on an electronic level. And yes, I'm very comfortable with you thinking how cool I am for discovering that. And I'm very comfortable with you not understanding that. But, in their own groups, they snicker to each other and go, oh, those fools. I mean, all this time we've been using quantum computers, which is something that's been discussed by, in news articles for many years now. We're using quantum computers, not standard computers. And because of that, we have these machines that are, really capable and really cool and not subject to the difficulties that real quantum computers have in the year 2019. And so that was always one of the marks of a real virtual adept. When you first get started with the group, you're told about Trinary computers. And the virtual adepts who raise their hand and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, then the other virtual adepts say to them, yeah, you get this. You pass. Or, the newbie there's like, look, we've been joking behind your back for a long time, and we got to tell you, the thing that we call a Trinary computer, we call it that, yes, and you should call it that, but really it's a quantum computer. So, I mean, just letting you know. Well, you've been in the dark too long. People are laughing about you. Come on, man.
But it is kind of interesting because a lot of traditions and paradigms have fundamental magical beliefs. Like if you try to explain homeopathy to someone, there's that brief moment where you're like, oh, okay. But hopefully you get to the point where you're like, wait, no, I've spent literally any time thinking about it. This makes less than no sense. And you're like, yeah, you're a reasonable person.
Yeah.
Homeopaths,
so that's how I treat Trinary computers, but I've never talked to anyone else who treats them that way. So
I thought they were idiotic. The idea of having negative on as a state, and just the fact that it is so presumptive on digital computing. Like anyone who's done anything with analog circuits, you have literally all numbers between 0 and 1. Like we've been using analog computers to simulate physical systems to an arbitrary degree of precision for almost a century at this point. So I could totally get behind the idea that there are numbers between 0 and 1. But alternatively, the fact that they have a third state, I like the idea of a virtual adept t-shirt that says virtual adepts, we can count to 2 or something like that. or the line from Futurama where Bender has a nightmare and he's like, it was all a stream of binary. I think I saw it too. And then Fry's like, it's okay, Bender. There's no such thing as 2. And it being somewhat analogous to that. But I will fully back your hot take on Trinary computers being like, being like, what's this object made out of? Plot device. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. The other thing is I would like to extend this idea out to a lot of Mage players of don't forget about other gadgets. I talked to a number of people who have played virtual adept characters and they enjoy it and I love it too. But they keep saying, yeah, I always have this laptop, on my left arm, and everything I do through that. And it's like, well, okay, if you're having fun and your storyteller likes it, have your fun. And I'm a terrible person for even asking this question, but really, I like to see other gadgets, other devices, other machines. I mean, virtual adepts can build them themselves. I mean, Technomagic is even virtual adept Technomagic is more than just a computer connected to a network. I mean, you can have all different types of devices and gadgets that they build, that they steal from the technocracy. I mean, one of the real interesting things about the virtual adepts is their paradigm is, depending on who you talk to, either the same as the technocracy or very similar. And that gets into a whole discussion of paradigms. Let's do that later. But my point is, a virtual adept can steal an item from a technocrat and basically read the manual and say, oh yeah, I get this. I understand this. This is something that I believe and I understand, and it speaks to knowledge that I've already gained, and I'm going to pick this up and use it. Whereas an Etherite scientist, the capital S, basically a son of Ether mage, might understand it and might not. I think that's worth discussing. And a mystical mage would pick up a technomagic device and say, yeah, this is a real thing, but I don't know how to use it, or if I do use it, I don't know what the heck's going to happen. And a storyteller is within their right to say, yeah, you hit the button and nothing happens because you don't know what this does. You didn't prime the flux capacitor or whatever. So
you got to believe in it. You got to Tinkerbell the shit.
Yeah. Whereas virtual adept picks it up and looks it over and says, you know what? I think this is an actual model of that thing that they were discussing 20 years ago that I captured the document on. And you know what? I'll bet if I hit this button and then turn this knob, oh yeah, I'm using this thing. And the other mystical mages in the Cabal are going, dude, you're awesome. You can use that thing.
I just like those literal words being done, just like a whole bunch of stoner mages being like, whoa, dude, he did the thing. And also putting that on a t-shirt along with the virtual adepts. Yeah, high-tech stuff, I'm kind of give or take on. I tend to run very talisman and device light chronicles. I hate having to do the thing where you have to start keeping track of your players' magical items, so I tend to never bring them up. But that's me being lazy as a storyteller.
Yeah, I can see that approach. I don't actually consider that a lazy storyteller approach. I think that's a legitimate way to approach Mage and work with your players. But there are plenty of people who like the technomagical devices. I enjoy them too. And I just like to remind people, hey, your virtual adept is not chained to that laptop. I mean, they can use other things. You can build devices. You can capture devices from the technocracy. You can take something from your own home, take a power tool from the garage, God forbid, and soup it up, do something different with it. I mean, there are more possibilities. You're not just typing keys. You're not just putting a jack into the neural interface next to your ear. I mean, there's more here. And don't forget about that. There's a lot of fun there.
What'd you do this weekend, Adam? I increased the RAM in my power drill. Oh, okay. How about that?
Yeah. I'm hoping nobody, we don't get into too much detail there, because the stuff I have in my garage, it's like somebody might look around my garage and say, dude, can we talk?
There was a tweet I saw some number of months ago that I was particularly fond of, where someone said, there's only one USB port. My friend's charging his book and I want to charge my cigarette. The future is stupid. And it kind of reminds me of
you've got me jealous now. The virtual adept t-shirt, we can count to 2. I've never seen that or heard of it, but I've got to have it now.
Okay.
I'm going to do a net search when we're done here.
Our sweet merch as our Mage Empire expands.
Man, that sounds awesome.
Yeah. So the next thing you had noted was, does this book need updating? And I guess my take is not really. Like, the surface level details need to be updated. Maybe you drop leet speak and you use periods and semicolons properly or something like that, and you don't replace E's with the number 3. But a lot of it makes its way forward. If anything, the update that needs to occur is so many of these ideas are now in the mainstream that you and I could, without ever having cracked a Mage book, could unironically have a conversation about transhumanism, or talk about quantum computers, or talk about digital immersion or something like that. The only update to me is we need to move the frontier of technology forward a little bit, but otherwise you can take this and run with it in the same way that the digital web book is by and large still valid. So to me, this very much goes in the, doesn't need updating. Not that much. Maybe you do some shining. Maybe you change some of the names involved, but you could take this and run with it.
Yeah, and I had much the same thinking. I do remember back when we did our digital web episode, we talked about how there was a digital web 2.0, and there is talk nowadays of publishing a supplement for Mage 20 called Digital Web 3.0. And so, yeah, there's this notion of, 1.0 must be outdated. And we took a look at it and we're like, well, some surface details could use some revising, but this book is not really outdated. And yeah, there was that episode where our own Joseph Aleo interviewed the main author for the the revised Virtual Adept Tradition book, and he said that at that time, the line developer, who was not Sotiros Brocato, said, "Yeah, we really want to update this book. We feel that the first Virtual Adept Tradition book could really use some updating." So I read the book now, and I read it this week, and my thinking is much the same as Terry's. I think, well, there are some surface details that look dated and could use some updating, but the core of this book, I don't think it's outdated. I think it brings up some interesting ideas. It opens up possibilities for the virtual adepts that are still valid today, still interesting today. And so I don't think this book is desperately in need of updating. But yeah, when I look at the surface details, I see game terms. This is still early first edition, or fairly early first edition of Mage, and so you have virtual adepts using mystic, Council of Nine terms for things. They talk about ascension and rotes and other game terms that in even second edition and later were attached to the mystical mages, and the technomancers had their own lingo. And so yeah, that you could update that. This book has a lot of 90s lingo. They didn't specifically put in the term leet speak, but I mean they refer to that. They have 90s expressions and stuff. And yeah, a lot of people reading this book might get the impression, oh, this book is old. And it's like, well, okay, that is easily remedied. The strong focus on the VA attitude, the in-your-face leet hacker attitude, that played better to a mid-90s audience than it does to a 2019 audience. So I would downplay that now. I wouldn't throw it out, but I would downplay it. So yeah, those three surface details get a bit dated, but when you really read the book and think about what is this book giving to me, I don't think it's outdated.
Yeah, it's very much a case where you can even keep a lot of those things in and point out that the VAs, every tradition at one point or another seemingly was cock of the walk, was top of the heap. And the virtual adepts, they're the new ones. They're the ones with the shiny new technomagic and so on. And it is perfectly reasonable to say, well, okay, you've been doing this from 1950 to 2020. That's 70 years. The bloom's come off the rose. Like your notion of eliteness no longer gets along. It's this very kind of white male centric notion of how the world should operate with chest thumping and some almost. The boastfulness of virtual adepts could leave the hermetics in the dust. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say maybe the virtual adepts haven't changed, but they need to. And this is a great source book for that. If you want to have a chronicle or a story, or at least the mood of the downfall of a paradigm, you can certainly bring up the virtual adepts who thought they were going to be the new hotness, and that just didn't pan out, and they haven't been able to keep up, and their paradigm has not pivoted, and the world is no longer obsessed. We have seen the damage that online flame wars can cause, especially when you bring it into an era of fake news and people being attacked by bot swarms and so on. That's no longer cool. That's destroying civilization.
Yeah. And it's nice when you mention of making this an element of a chronicle. I really like that, because you can take this chest-thumping VA attitude and look at it from two angles. The negative angle you just mentioned very well, and also the positive angle of we have this expression in our culture today, fake it till you make it, which is basically talk big about yourself, but at the same time, be working hard.
Yeah,
and
keep your head down.
Eventually, yeah, make your talk real, but you have to talk. But it's fake talk when you start, because you got to get your foot in the door. But once you get your foot in the door, you work hard and you become what you said you were at the start. And that's a positive take on the attitude. It's like, look, I'm faking it till I make it, but I am going to work hard and I am going to make it. And you got to have confidence. In Mage, more even than in our regular real life, in Mage, to work magic and to keep your head above water in the dangerous world of Mage, you've got to have very firm confidence and a very firm belief in yourself and your ability to make it. And so the VA attitude is not totally out of place. But yeah, as you so eloquently demonstrated for us, there's a dark side to this chest-thumping attitude. And this book puts it front and center so that if you're going to bring it into your chronicle, you've got a lot of ammo here.
So you recommending this puppy?
I give it a thumbs up. I say, regardless of what edition of Mage you are playing with your players, this book is going to be great. Even if you don't use the rule-specific information in the back, which there's not really a lot of it, even without that, there are legions here that are very interesting. There is a view of the virtual adepts and the world of Mage, and abstract ideas like transhumanism connected to the virtual adepts that is going to benefit your game. And even if you've got the revised VA trad book and you say, look, I've got a trad book, I'm doing pretty well here, I think you're going to benefit from getting this first one and taking a look at how the virtual adepts were portrayed and thought about in the early editions. Yeah, I really would recommend this book. I definitely give this book a thumbs up. I recommend it. Regardless of your edition, you're going to find something here that is worth reading. And it's only 66 pages, and a PDF of this is not going to cost very much, so do it. Press the button.
Undiscounted, this is $12 on Drive-Thru RPG. It's part of Songs of Science, which was the Traditions Gathered Volume 1. You also get the Sons of Ether tradition book and the Order of Hermes tradition book, and both of those clock in at about 70 pages from cover to cover. I find it somewhat ironic that this of our book reviews was the first one where I read the Dead Tree copy, and it was for the virtual adepts. I think they would find some irony in that. But yeah, at $12, this is an easy recommendation. And it's neat to see how traditions have changed over time. If you wind up with revised, great. Those run about $9-10 a pop for the full PDF. And I think this is a nice sweet spot between the 2-page description that's given maybe in a core rulebook and those 100-page revised ones. So this goes in my recommend without difficulty. Doesn't even need to be discounted on Drive-Thru RPG to pick up the 3-volume set with the Order of Hermes and the Sons of Ether.
Yeah, and boy, when we get to our episode on the Sons of Ether, that first tradition book was a winner. So if you're getting that in the deal, you are getting quite a deal.
That episode is just going to be us going, wow, this was good. Wasn't it so good? Yes, it was good. Let's talk about how good it was. But
yeah,
just a spoiler alert.
Yeah, I think our producer is going to have something to say to us about that one.
Just 5 minutes of you praising it endlessly. It's our best,
Didn't
most downloaded episode.
Yeah. Didn't you just love it? Well, I loved it more than you.
Sons of Ether, great book or greatest book?
Okay. But to wrap up this one, I think that gives you a firm idea of what the book is about, what we thought of it, and why we give it a thumbs up. So I think with that, we're ready to lead out. I'm just going to let everybody know that you can contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com. Please let us know your questions, comments, or feedback, positive or negative. We can take it. At least Terry can. I don't know about me. But also, you can subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and TuneIn. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, you can give us a positive rating on iTunes, because when you do, that makes us more visible to other people's searches for podcast material to listen to, and you help get our name out there for other people to discover.
In addition to that, you can now listen to us on Spotify. So if you want to do a favor, just load that up on your computer, hit play, walk away, come back several hours later, improve our ranking there. Additionally, we put a call for players who would be interested in possibly doing a live play project. We've received a number of submissions for that. If and when that gets off the ground, we'll be contacting those people. If you're still interested, by all means, email us at magethepodcast@gmail.com. And as a sneak preview, hopefully by the time this episode goes out, I may have my first submission to the Storyteller Vault going out. So hopefully we'll be able to push that in the future. Adam, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I would definitely want to see that when it comes out, and I would be happy to push that if it's anything like the content I've heard from you in the past. Also, you can follow us on Twitter, at Mage the Podcast, if you want to follow us on Twitter there. And hey, to all you Mage fans out there, this is Adam Simpson signing off towards Ascension.
Mage strong.